I really like Simon Peter. His larger-than-life personality radiates from the pages of the Gospels, but as Nancy Barrett would say, he is a real stinker. There's a reason Jesus chose him, and there's a reason he appears in almost every book of the New Testament and in the writings of the church fathers. He is naturally confident. He was rash. He was impulsive. He acted and spoke before he thought. But as a spiritual director will teach you, generally our strengths and our weaknesses are the same, and they're tied together. So he had this rare quality we sometimes call genuine or real. He was apparently the same person on the inside as the person you saw on the outside. He was honest without having to make the attempt. That said, I think people who knew him were constantly dumbfounded by him, scratching their heads because of him. I mean, what kind of person, upon walking up a mountain at night and seeing your friend transfigured before you, seeing two long-dead Jewish heroes appear with them, each bathed in light, not light that's shining on them, but coming out of them, what kind of person has a lot to say in that moment? I can think of some things I might have said, none that I could repeat right now. And I know at that moment I would not have proposed a building project, despite what some of you might think. Maybe Peter is excited because on this mountain he finally discovers the Jesus that he wanted, the Jesus he had been waiting for. You see, Peter knew the Jewish scriptures. And like all the disciples, he had been trying to connect the dots between what he was experiencing with Jesus and what he thought he knew about the Messiah from the Hebrew scriptures. And one thing Peter knew for sure was that in Zechariah chapter 14, it says that on the day of the Lord, the day God would finally set everything right, the people were to celebrate the Feast of Booths. And if Moses has shown up, if Elijah has shown up, Peter probably saw that as a sign. The day of the Lord is upon them, and he is ready to start building. He's thinking, finally, enough with the mystery, enough with the parables, enough with the vague teaching and all this talk of suffering. Now it's time for glory. Now it's time to get to work. And then he hears a voice from the cloud, which drives him to his knees in fear, saying, "This is my son, listen to him." And the text tells us Peter is silent. You see, Peter had a plan. He had an idea of what to expect. He thought he knew how the Messiah was going to act, what he was going to do. And the text tells us instead that now he's silent. And Luke is the one gospel that tells us this, but when they come down from the mountain, the text tells us that he and the other disciples are silent. And it doesn't mention that Jesus commanded them to be silent. We tend to think that Peter embarrassed himself here on the mountain, and that his big moment happened 6 days later when he confesses Jesus is the Christ. And it was such a big moment that Peter got a new name out of it. But almost immediately, after his faithful confession, Peter is pulling Jesus aside and he's chewing him out because he tells his disciples he must suffer and die. Jesus said to Peter in that occasion, "Get behind me, Satan, because you're focused on human things and not the things of God." So despite his confession of faith, Peter did not get who Jesus was and what he was doing. And seeing Jesus transfigured only for a brief moment reinforced maybe his preconceived idea of what Jesus was supposed to be: powerful, a mighty conqueror, unlike me, unlike you. Peter was not ready to accept a Messiah who would suffer, who would hang on a tree. How could the Messiah die at the hands of the Romans? He's supposed to defeat the Romans, to restore the kingdom to Israel. Peter was not ready to listen. But everything changed when he heard God's voice. He's finally silent. The most important thing I will say this morning, and maybe ever will say to you, is this: if we're going to hear, we have to shut up. If we're going to hear, we have to be silent. We have to learn to be silent. There's another word in our text that's really interesting, and that's the word departure. In Luke, it says Moses and Elijah were speaking to Jesus about his departure, and that could also be translated about his exodus. Moses had been through the Exodus. Elijah had, in a sense, been through the Exodus and ran to Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, and just like Moses met God on that mountain, just as Jesus is meeting God on the mountain. And I hate it when you make these kind of applications from text, but it's an important one. Here we have Jesus about to go through his Exodus, to the cross, to Jerusalem, to suffer and die. And here he has two people before him who have been through what he has been through. And here is his best friend Peter, and he can't shut up. The greatest thing we can do when those around us are suffering is to show up and then shut up. That's what I learned in CPE. And the greatest way we can learn and actually maybe hear God's voice is if we learn to be silent. So put yourself in Peter's position. You hear the voice of God, the same voice that spoke the universe into creation, and then the living word of God made flesh touches you on the shoulder and says, "Do not be afraid." As they're walking down the mountain, Jesus again tells Peter and the disciples that the Son of Man must suffer at the hands of the rulers of the people. And this time, Peter doesn't argue. But he did what that voice told him to do. He listened. He was quiet. I think on the Mount of Transfiguration, we all meet the Jesus we want. Transfigured, powerful, otherworldly. But as we prepare with Peter and the other disciples to walk with Jesus to the cross during the season of Lent that will begin on Ash Wednesday this week, may we have the strength to set aside our expectations and plans and see there on a different mountain, the Mount of Calvary, not the Jesus we want, but the Jesus we need. None of us wants a Messiah who suffers. Because if we take Jesus at his word, he tells us we must follow in his steps. Maybe God is inviting us this Lent not to put all the pieces together, but to set aside our expectations and listen. To really listen. Peter learned to listen. And there's a reason Jesus chose him. And although he was himself Peter on this mountain, it was Peter who was transfigured. Peter became someone new. May we do this. May we learn to make space in our lives for God through silence, and maybe we will encounter the wonder and the mystery of God.